Hey y'all, it's Tay with Mom on the Spectrum, and I am back today with a video that will be answering the question, what is autism? We've been given a lot of examples of what it is through the media, but how accurate is that? And is that a good representation of the types of people who are on the spectrum? I'm going to be sharing my own description of what I take autism to be in my own experience. This is after a lifetime of experience and a year and a half of research, observation, and study since my own professional diagnosis. And then I'll walk us through a professional description and diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5. I'll explain what that is in just a little bit, and we'll walk through each part of the diagnostic criteria, and we'll talk about how that may or may not affect you and or a loved one who might be on the spectrum. Excited. I have a lot of new equipment to use today. I have a lapel mic, which is actually like wired up. Who am I? And I have these fancy lights that are in front of me. It took me longer than I care to admit to get set up. And then as soon as I hit record, my neighbors started mowing their lawn. So just keeping it real over here. If you haven't already subscribed, if you could please do that real quick. It's so simple and so easy. You just click the red button below this video. That really helps me out so much and helps my videos reach more people. I've been so touched by the response to this channel, and I just feel really lucky to be able to get to make these videos. Okay, so I really think that there's a lot of confusion around what autism is, and I think it's one of the reasons why it took me so long to get my own diagnosis, because I was just confused. I thought I knew what autism was. I thought that it was something that you could see just by looking at someone. I realize now how incorrect that is, but we all have to start somewhere. That's where I started. I didn't even consider autism as something that I might be experiencing, even though I've spent years in therapy and years of my own personal research and study trying to understand my brain better. I've considered so many different diagnoses: ADHD, OCD, highly sensitive person, you name it. And finally one day I stumbled upon autism. And I talk more about that experience in another video. I'll provide the link to that if you're interested how I realized that I was on the spectrum and what that journey was like. But this video is more about the importance of understanding what it actually is so that more people can get the help and the representation that they need. For me, it is such an intimate inner experience, and that's what autism means. Actually, autism is like self-ism. It's very much experienced within myself and not really something that many other people would pick up on or even be able to understand. I also wanted to share that I came across an article recently that I'll post a link to in the description saying that the stereotypical autistic traits, such as maybe hand flapping or what neurotypicals would perceive as extreme social awkwardness, those instances might actually be the minority of cases for people on the spectrum. That does not mean that they are any less important or less worthy of representation. We need representation for everyone on the spectrum, but I think it goes to show just how far away we are from actually understanding what the true definition of autism is and how many people are affected by it. What I want to do is I just typed up a brief description of how autism has presented itself in my life and how it seems to present in those that I've interacted with and learned from in my journey. All right, so here's my current definition of autism, which I'm sure will change over the course of the next days, weeks, months, years, and I'll include this in the description if you're interested in it. I'm going to be reading off my cheat sheets here. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by social differences, repetitive behaviors, adherence to rules and routines, intensely focused special interests, unique sensory experiences and needs, and a restless mind. This can feel like a frustrating and continual processing or decoding of the world around us. Balancing these symptoms often leads to meltdowns where it feels like one is incapable of processing more sensory input, or shutdowns where one needs to retreat to a silent place for an extended period of time before rejoining in normal activities. Many times these symptoms are imperceptible to others who are not autistic due to camouflaging or masking. Camouflaging or masking is the process through which autistic people consciously or subconsciously behave in order to appear more socially appropriate. This can affect body language, tone of voice, eye contact, word choice, and more. People on the spectrum tend to find comfort and relief from overstimulation and overthinking by spending time alone, balancing their sensory experiences, stimming, and working on or studying their special interests. All of these things have affected my life for as long as I can remember, but they've been under the surface. There's one really interesting part of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria that I'll get to later that helps me really understand why these were under the surface for such a long time. I'd also like to point out that a lot of people who are actually autistic, you can actually search that hashtag actuallyautistic. You'll find a lot of autistic content creators and people who are providing resources for older individuals on the spectrum. By older, I just mean adult individuals who are on the spectrum, because until recently, there just has not been very much information or resources available to us. So that's that's a really great hashtag to check out. And many actually autistic people are no longer referring to autism as a disorder, but as a difference. So you might hear it referred to as autism spectrum difference. Again, let me say real quick so I don't get all the comments. If you met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So this is my experience. You may feel strongly that it is a disorder. I totally respect that perspective. So why don't we jump into the DSM and explore what they have to say about autism. If you're unfamiliar with the DSM, it is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Disorders, which is primarily used in America for diagnosing mental health disorders. There's a whole history of the DSM that we can get into, and I was going to try to include it in this video, but I didn't want this to be like an hour-long video. So if y'all are interested in the history of that, let me know in the comments, and I'll plan on making a video about that in the future because I have my notes on it, but that's not what we're talking about today. The 5th version of DSM was published in 2013, and that is the most current version that we have. One notable thing to mention is that the DSM no longer uses the term Asperger's as a diagnosis. It's a very problematic term that's still widely used, and for more information about why it's so problematic, you can check out one of my other videos that I'll also post a link to in the description. Okay, so here's the DSM-5. To meet diagnostic criteria for ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, according to DSM-5, a child, let's use individual, must have persistent deficits in each of 3 areas of social communication and interaction, plus at least 2 of 4 types of restricted repetitive behaviors. We're going to get into what those are. So these are the criteria for persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. Number 1, deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal speech approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. I don't have much commentary on this first bullet point. I feel like this is a really big area where females especially are really good at masking. The second bullet point here is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. So I think it's kind of clear to see here how that line item can bring up a wide spectrum of how that would present for many people. I know I can really relate to the poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication. There's so many times when I feel like there's no way I can communicate what's in my head. I think in a very different language than I actually speak in. And so learning how to bridge that gap between what's in my head and what actually comes out has been a lifelong skill that I've developed. And something that really wears me out if I have to fall back on that skill too much. Abnormalities in eye contact, I guess, is kind of a stereotypical autism trait, but I noticed once I started studying myself after my diagnosis that whenever I make eye contact with people, I actually don't, I look more like at the cheekbone, or I'll find a reason to look around the room, or I'll be doing something, or I'll look at my hands. If it looks like I'm looking you in the eye, I'm not. Because whenever I actually purposely look people in the eyes, I've done this with my husband, I don't really hear what's being said. It's like I can't look in someone's eyes and also absorb the information that's coming out of their mouths. Lack of nonverbal communication. I'm always baffled by how females are so outgoing with their body language. Lawnmower. They're literally right outside my window, like 6 feet away from the camera. But when neurotypical females see a friend, their arms will open up, they'll go over and touch them in some way that I can never not make awkward. Whenever they're talking to each other, they'll touch each other on the arm or the shoulder. And I just feel like if I were to ever do that, it would be so completely forced and fake. I do not understand how that can be innate to anyone. Okay, the third bullet point here. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. I know relationships for me, especially in grade school and high school, I would always watch what other people were doing and copy it. I understood that it was important to invite people over to your house. I understood that it was meaningful to make cards for people or buy gifts, but none of these things come to me innately. It's definitely something that I have to plan for. Like if I opened up my Google Calendar, you would see that every special event is accounted for in my calendar with an alarm. I've survived off of all types of reminders like that in terms of how to relate to other people, and have just studied what is important to other people and tried to copy that to the best of my ability. Sharing imaginative play feels like torture to me. I do not like using my imagination. I wish that I did, and I try, but I just can't. It even shows up in what I like to read. I love to read. I can really only tolerate nonfiction. Occasionally I can do fiction, but I really tend to shy away from it because world building is really, really hard for me. So anytime that I learn a new story or new characters, it's very hard for me to actually picture what they might look like or what they're actually doing in the story. In fiction books in school, I would have to SparkNote almost everything that I read because I couldn't really envision how the characters were interacting with each other. And I never realized that that wasn't normal until recently. And then it was like, such a huge light bulb for me. Okay, so those are the 3 criteria for persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. So for a diagnosis, you would have to meet persistent deficits in each of those 3 areas that we just discussed. The next section is restricted and repetitive behaviors. And in this section, you have to have at least 2 of the 4 types of restricted or repetitive behaviors listed. The first one is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. The examples given are lining up toys or flipping objects, echolalia, which is the repetition of sounds or speech, and idiosyncratic phrases. I have had repetitive motor movements my entire life. I don't know that most people would ever have noticed that. I constantly click my teeth inside. I used to blink whenever I would see words on a page. I would blink for every letter that I saw. I also drum on everything. I pick up my nails all the time. So I'm constantly moving. I've always loved to dance, and I think I've kind of self-regulated through dance in a lot of ways. I was in marching band. I always found ways to be active and use my body to move. In class, it was very, very hard for me to sit still, and I would drum on my desk as quietly as I could so that I wouldn't stir up any trouble because I was a rule follower. I tapped my shoes all the time. So constant repetitive movement, it doesn't have to be the stereotypical hand flapping, even though that's definitely a stim or a repetitive movement for some people on the spectrum. The second type of repetitive or restrictive behavior is insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, and smiling, or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Example, extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, need to take same route or eat same food every day. I'm just smiling because this one is me. And sometimes I pretend like I don't operate this way, but I do. And I also have 2 children who are the same way. I have the same type of logic whenever I have a conversation. I have scripts in my head that I follow. Safe questions to ask. I usually comment on people's clothing or their shoes. Hey, I really like your shoes. I really like your earrings. Because that way it doesn't really require conversation, but it lets them know like, I'm a nice person. And it makes me feel like I'm present socially without necessarily starting a conversation. So I definitely have these rules and routines that I follow all the time. And if anybody were completely aware of all the rules and routines that I follow, I think you would be totally overwhelmed. The third criteria in the restricted and repetitive behaviors is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Example, strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or perseverative interests. Perseverative interests are like fixated interests, things that you do all the time. You like go into a black hole and the world disappears and you can do it for hours without knowing what time it is or caring about anything else. I would actually push back on this a little bit and say that the highly restricted part has baffled me a little bit. And actually, now that I'm talking out loud, it might be a combination of my ADHD with autism. I have a wide-ranging list of interests that I can spend an abnormal amount of time researching and learning about. And then lastly, the fourth criteria here is hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Examples, apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascination with lights or movement. This bullet point affects me so much. My sensory needs are vast. I made a video recently about my favorite sensory products that help me regulate my senses. I realized just how many accommodations I have needed in order to regulate myself. But sensory differences are a huge aspect of autism. Things can seem louder to you, taste can be more intense to you, or you might be underreactive to things, underreactive to pain. There's all different types of ways that it can present, but the important thing to understand is that there are sensory differences associated with autism. And then the last part of this diagnostic criteria are just the final statements of what must be met in order for the diagnosis to be given. Number one, the symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but, and this is the big part I was talking about that really changed my understanding of autism, autism. They may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities, or may be masked by learned strategies. That right there, when I understood that autism might not really present until later in life, it made so much sense to me. My husband and I both feel like when we had our second kid and he started talking and there were multiple streams of information coming in all the time that I couldn't control, I just became this version of myself that I did not recognize. I could no longer keep everything under the surface. I could no longer keep managing all my rules and routines and procedures that kept my workflow going every single day and kept me safe, because I was also trying to keep two tiny humans alive. And so once that social demand was presented in the terms of being a parent, I was no longer able to mask or camouflage even to myself. And that's when I realized that I might be autistic. The second qualification here is that symptoms must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. And the last says these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or global development delay. Intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur. To make comorbid diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability, social communication should be below that expected for general developmental level. Another important thing to note is that in the DSM-5, they say here at the bottom that individuals with a well-established DSM-IV diagnosis of autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, PDD-NOS, which was kind of a catch-all when an autism diagnosis wasn't necessarily the best choice. Now they're saying those individuals should be given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So now in the DSM-5, it's become a big umbrella term rather than having all these little tiny classifications like Asperger's or PDD-NOS. It's all just ASD or autism spectrum disorder. I know that was a lot of information, but I definitely think it's helpful to kind of see a line-by-line explanation of how autism is diagnosed and categorized. I still think that we have a long way to go in terms of how it's classified and diagnosed, because I still think there's so many different ways that it presents. And I think females in particular and older individuals are really not helped by the fact that it's still viewed as something that children primarily deal with, because children grow up to be adults. We need a lot more resources. We need a lot more support for females and for older individuals, adults in general, and just a broader understanding in life with our families and friends and loved ones and the media and the world at large. We need a better understanding of what autism actually is and how it presents. So I hope if you've learned something in this video that you'd be willing to share it with someone else so that we can continue spreading awareness and acceptance. The more people who really understand what autism is, the more inclusivity we can have, the more representation we can have in movies and TV, which really helps change the landscape globally in terms of getting support and resources and funding. So whatever you feel like you can do today to raise awareness and acceptance, I encourage you to please do that. As always, please feel free to comment on this video with ideas that you might have for future videos. I love the suggestions, and I have a list so long on my phone of videos that I'm in the process of making for y'all. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. If you enjoyed this video, if you could please give me a thumbs up, make sure that you've subscribed, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!